I used to believe that if there were two people I could trust without question, it would be my husband and my daughter. I was wrong. I built a thriving interior design business from scratch. I raised my daughter Amber on my own for nearly 3 decades, and when I met Craig, my second husband, I thought I finally found someone who would support me, not take from me. After our wedding, I added Craig's name to the deed of my waterfront home. It was a gesture of trust. I didn't know I was handing him ammunition. When my business hit a rough patch, I expected support. Instead, I got cold shoulders, whispers behind closed doors, and silence when I walked into a room. Then came the betrayal. They tried to have me declared insane. My own daughter, my husband, for the house, for the business, for everything. But what they didn't know was what I had hidden in the safe. If you've ever been betrayed by the people closest to you, this story is for you. If you've ever felt betrayed by your own family, this story will hit hard. Stay with me, because what they found in the safe didn't just ruin their plan, it ended everything they thought they controlled. Subscribe for more real revenge stories every day on Outlaw Alley. Comment below. What would you have done if your own child turned against you? I wasn't born into wealth. Everything I had, I built. I started my interior design business out of my 1-bedroom apartment in Miami, working late nights. While my daughter Amber slept in the next room, I'd measure curtains with one hand and stir spaghetti sauce with the other. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and I made it work. Amber was my whole world. I poured everything into giving her a better life, private school dance lessons, even a spot in one of the best design programs when she turned 18. I wanted her to have a head start, not a handout. And for a while, I thought she appreciated that. When I met Craig, I was already successful. I owned my home free and clear. The mortgage had been paid off years ago, and business was booming. Craig was charming, a real gentleman, always bringing flowers, holding doors, telling me how much he admired my drive. He said he loved that I was independent. That should have been my first warning. We got married 2 years after we met. Amber was in college by then, and she was polite, but never truly warm to him. I assumed it was just adjustment. I didn't push it. After the wedding, I made what I thought was a generous decision. I added Craig's name to the deed of the house. He didn't ask, I offered. I thought love meant sharing, and at the time, I truly believed we were building a life together. For the next few years, things seemed fine. Amber graduated and started assisting part-time at my firm. I was proud to see her follow in my footsteps, even if she sometimes came off entitled. She didn't have to scrape and hustle the way I did, and it showed, but still, I thought we were close. Then the business hit a rough patch. One of our biggest clients went under, and 3 major projects fell through in the same quarter. Suddenly, I was covering payroll from my savings. It wasn't a crisis, but it was tight. That's when Craig changed. He stopped asking how work was going. Instead, he started criticizing everything, my spending, my decisions, even the way I managed my staff. He acted like I was incompetent, like I had somehow forgotten how to run the very business I'd built from nothing. At first, I brushed it off. Stress? Maybe. A man's pride getting bruised because he couldn't fix the situation, but then Amber started joining in. They began having side conversations when they thought I wasn't listening, whispered phone calls that stopped the moment I walked into the room. I caught them exchanging glances across the table, the kind that say more than words ever could. I wanted to believe I was being paranoid, that my own mind was turning against me. That's what they wanted me to believe too. But I wasn't imagining it. One of my longest-standing employees, someone I trusted deeply, came to me one afternoon. She'd overheard Craig on the phone talking about documents and evaluation protocols. My stomach dropped. The next day, I went through Amber's laptop. When she left it open in the office, I didn't want to, but I had to know. What I found shattered me. Text messages between Amber and Craig, dozens of them, discussing how they could claim I was mentally unfit, how they could have me committed for her own good, so Craig could stabilize the company and Amber could manage things temporarily. Temporary, of course, meaning just long enough to make it permanent. Amber even asked if she'd get a percentage of the business or just a piece of the house. Craig told her not to worry, that once I was out of the picture, they'd sort everything out. I can't describe the kind of betrayal that sits in your bones like that. It wasn't just my husband scheming against me. It was my daughter, my blood, The child I nursed through fevers sat up with during nightmares, celebrated every birthday with homemade cakes, and she was ready to lock me away for a paycheck. I wanted to scream, confront them, burn the whole thing down, but something in me, something cold, sharp, and still told me to wait. That night I stared at the ceiling until morning, and when the sun came up I called my attorney. I had only one sentence. It's time. When I told my attorney, it's time, he didn't ask questions. He just said, come in, first thing tomorrow. I spent that night in silence. Not sadness, not rage, just silence, the kind that comes before a storm. At his office, I laid everything out, the text messages, the conversations I'd overheard, the documents they'd begun drafting. My attorney, Richard, listened without interrupting. When I was done, he leaned back, steepled his fingers, and said, Rebecca, you're going to win, but we have to be patient. You need to let them think they're winning. It went against every instinct I had. Every part of me wanted to throw their betrayal in their faces, but I didn't. Instead, I played the part. I came home smiling, told Craig I'd be heading to California for 2 weeks to visit my sister. I just need some clarity. I said, some time to think. He nodded like a man who'd just scored a point. He even hugged me tight. I remember how cold he felt. Amber barely said goodbye. I packed lightly and left the next morning. But I didn't go to California. I checked into a quiet boutique hotel under a different name, and from there I watched Amber and Craig thought I was gone. Safe to proceed. And they did. They filed preliminary paperwork with the court claiming concern over my mental state. They outlined my erratic financial behavior, cited the business losses, and included letters they'd forged from employees describing my mood swings and delusional thinking. I got all of it forwarded to Richard. He smiled and said, "Good, let them dig their grave." While they were busy pushing their lies through legal channels, I was busy gathering everything they didn't know existed, because here's the truth, I saw this coming years ago. After I added Craig's name to the deed, something started to feel off. Small comments, subtle power plays. I never told anyone, but I went back to my attorney and asked him to review the paperwork. That's when he suggested we quietly file a correction one that would technically void the joint deed due to a clerical error Craig never noticed, and legally, the house stayed mine. Around the same time, I began moving assets. I sold the business not publicly, not in a way that showed up in headlines, but privately to a holding company I created fronted by a proxy. On paper, I no longer owned the firm. In reality, I controlled everything. Craig just never asked the right questions. I even had Richard draft an ironclad postnup, technically a prenuptial addendum signed during a financial review Craig had conveniently forgotten. The clause was clear. Any attempt to access premarital assets would result in forfeiture of all marital claims. His signature was right there in black ink. I wasn't just building a business, I was building a defense, and now it was time to use it. After 2 weeks, I returned home. Craig greeted me with faux concern. Amber was all tight smiles and rehearsed lines. That night over dinner, I asked them calmly, "Anything happen while I was away?" They played dumb-lied right to my face. My own daughter said, "We just missed you." Mom, I let them stew for another day. Then I invited them to sit down for a family meeting. Craig came with a briefcase. Amber looked smug. They thought this was the big moment, the ambush. But I beat them to it. I told them I knew. Every text, every forged letter, every visit to that shady lawyer who promised them guardianship over me. Craig tried to play it cool. "Rebecca, I think you're confused. We were just trying to help." That's when I said the words that changed everything. "Go open the safe." He froze. Amber's smile dropped. I repeated it, calmly, clearly. "Go open the safe, Craig. You've always wanted what's in there." He stood up slowly and walked down the hall. Amber followed. I stayed at the table sipping my wine, waiting. Minutes later, they returned, pale, trembling. Craig dropped a folder on the table. "What is this?" he whispered. Inside was everything. The invalidated deed. The business transfer, the postnup agreement, copies of their messages, bank transfers, witness statements. It wasn't just evidence, it was an execution file. Craig's voice cracked. "You can't use this in court." I cut him off. "Already filed. Richard submitted everything last week. Amber said nothing. She was shaking. I looked her in the eyes and asked why she didn't answer. I didn't need one. I stood up, walked out of the room, and let them sit with the weight of what they'd done. They came for my house, my company, my freedom. What they got was the end of everything they thought they controlled. I wish I could say I felt powerful when I saw their faces, when they opened that safe and everything came crashing down. But I didn't feel powerful. I felt tired. The kind of tired that seeps into your bones when you finally stop pretending the people you love are good. Because even though I had the upper hand, even though I had legal control evidence and leverage, I had still lost something far more valuable than a house or a company. I had lost my daughter. Amber didn't say a word when I laid out the evidence. Not when I told her I'd read every message she sent Craig. Not when I told her I knew she'd push to move things faster while I was out of state. She just stared at me, her eyes glassy, like she was looking through me, not at me. I asked her again, "Why?" And she finally answered so softly I almost missed it. "Because you always make everything about you." Those words hurt more than anything Craig had done. Because I realized she believed them. To her, my success wasn't a legacy. It was a shadow she couldn't crawl out from under. She didn't see the sacrifices I made. The nights I skipped dinner so she could have a school uniform. The years I dated no one, because I didn't want her growing up with the wrong men in the house. She didn't see the woman who built an empire to give her daughter a better start. She only saw the empire, and she wanted a piece. Craig, he was easier. Predictable, greedy. A coward in a suit. When I showed him the postnup agreement, he tried to bluff his way out, said I forged his signature, said I manipulated him into signing it. But my lawyer had not only his signature, he had the video footage, the date-stamped email, where Craig asked for clarification and still signed the notary's testimony. It was airtight, legally, ethically, strategically, and still, he tried to lie. He looked at me like a man who'd been wronged, like I had set him up and maybe I had, but I never would have needed to, if he hadn't tried to destroy me first. I remember standing in my own living room that night, watching them argue, Amber crying, Craig pacing, and I realized something brutal. This wasn't salvageable. Not the marriage, not the mother-daughter bond, not the future I thought I'd have. They had crossed a line, and I had crossed it back. There was no going home again. Not really. The next morning, I filed the divorce papers. Craig was officially served the following Monday. He contested it. Of course, tried to drag it out. But with the prenuptial violations, his forged affidavits, and the conspiracy to manipulate medical evaluations, he had no ground left to stand on. Amber tried one last time. She showed up to the office, tears in her eyes, saying she'd been manipulated by Craig, that she never meant for it to go so far, that she just wanted to feel like she mattered in my life again. And I believed her. For about 5 seconds. Then I remembered how she'd tried to have me declared mentally incompetent. How she planned to move into my house. How she asked Craig for her share. I told her something I never thought I'd say. I will always love you, but I don't trust you, and I never will again. She left without another word, and I sat down at my desk, alone, not victorious, not broken, just clear. They thought they could take everything from me by making me look crazy, but what they didn't understand was I had gone crazy. The moment I realized the two people I loved most had become strangers, that kind of grief drives you to one of two things: collapse or calculation. I chose the second. They wanted me locked away. Instead, I locked them out of everything: my home, my business, my life. And that was the moment everything changed, not just for them but for me. Because now, I had nothing left to protect but myself, and I was finally ready to live like that. People think revenge is loud, explosive, dramatic, but the best revenge, it's quiet, it's strategic, it's clean. The moment I filed the divorce papers, my plan was already in motion. Craig had no idea just how much I'd prepared for this first. I filed a formal complaint with the Florida Bar Association against the lawyer he'd used in the guardianship filing. The attorney had overlooked a mountain of legal ethics by moving forward with a petition based on false psychiatric claims. Then I contacted a forensic handwriting expert just to be thorough. She authenticated that several of the letters Craig submitted as evidence of my mental decline were in fact written by him, not just the language, the handwriting that would come back to haunt him. And while Craig was scrambling to find a legal team that didn't immediately tell him he was toast, I took the next step. I froze every joint account. I had already moved most assets long before the betrayal, but I wanted him to feel what it was like to reach for something and come up empty. His credit cards, declined, his fun money account, gone. The house, still in my name legally, and I had filed for immediate exclusive occupancy pending divorce. He was locked out of his own plan. I hired private security for the property, not to intimidate but to document every move he made, every word he spoke. If he tried anything, it would be on camera. He didn't take it well. He screamed at the front gate one night for almost an hour. Amber came with him. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, arms folded, watching as her partner lost control. They had expected me to crumble. Instead, they watched me take back everything. But the best part, the safe. They had thought they'd found everything that night. The deed, the postnup, the evidence of ownership transfer. But there was one thing they didn't find. A second compartment. It was hidden behind a false panel. Something only I knew about inside were the documents I hadn't shown them yet. A timeline of every meeting, every conversation, every piece of evidence I'd gathered. Digital backups, audio recordings, witness statements, even old text messages Amber had sent to friends bragging about getting the house soon. It wasn't just insurance. It was the nail in the coffin. I handed it all over to Richard. He said, "This isn't just divorce court. This is criminal." So we filed Craig, and Amber were both hit with civil conspiracy allegations, an intentional plan to defraud and defame me for personal gain. We even had enough to submit the case to the state attorney's office. Charges were being considered for fraud, defamation, and attempted unlawful commitment. Amber panicked. She called me again, left a voicemail at 2 a.m. crying, saying Craig had pushed her into everything, that she was just scared. But by then, I didn't care. She wasn't the little girl with pigtails asking me to read bedtime stories anymore. She was a grown woman who tried to lock her mother in a hospital for money, and Craig. He knew the game was up. He tried to negotiate a quiet settlement. He offered to walk away if I paid him a portion of the business profits. I laughed. "Craig," I said, "you don't get to negotiate when you're standing in ashes." He didn't respond, and honestly, there was nothing left to say. After the court froze all financial claims he tried to make, and after his own lawyer dropped him, Craig disappeared for a while. Word was he left the state. Maybe out of shame, maybe to avoid the heat, Amber stayed in Miami. She tried to salvage her reputation, but it was too late. The story had gotten around quietly but powerfully. In the design world, reputation is everything, and no one wanted to be associated with someone who tried to commit her own mother. My firm, it bounced back. Within 3 months, I had new contracts, new staff, a new office space, clean, modern, filled with light and no ghosts. I took one final step. I rewrote my will. Everything was placed into a living trust administered by a board of people I actually trust. If anything ever happens to me, there's no ambiguity, no loophole, no more chances for betrayal. The best part, I felt free. Not just from them, but from the burden of pretending that everything was okay, that I could still fix them, that love alone was enough to make people do the right thing. It's not. Sometimes people will smile in your face while they're sharpening the knife behind your back, but if you're smart, if you stay quiet, if you plan carefully, you'll be the one standing when the dust settles. The court date came faster than I expected. Craig showed up in a navy suit that didn't quite fit anymore. His tie was crooked. He looked smaller than I remembered, like the pressure had hollowed him out. Amber didn't sit with him. She was on the opposite side of the gallery, dressed in beige, no makeup, her hair pulled back like she wanted to disappear into the woodwork. She didn't make eye contact with me. I didn't expect her to. The judge was direct. He had read the files, seen the statements, heard the recordings. There was no need for theatrics. Craig's defense tried to claim he was concerned for my well-being, that his actions were misguided but not malicious. But then we played the audio. Craig bragging to his friend on the phone about getting her locked up for a while, just long enough to sign some papers. Amber's texts followed. The ones where she asked, "Once she's in, how fast can I move into the house?" The courtroom was silent. The judge stared at Craig for a long moment and then said the words, "I'll never forget. Sir, you didn't act out of concern. You acted out of greed and you weaponized the law to try and steal what was never yours." He ruled in my favor. Every asset was returned. Every financial claim Craig had tried to make was dismissed with prejudice. He was ordered to pay my legal fees plus restitution for the emotional distress and defamation. But that wasn't the real victory. It came 2 weeks later. I received a formal letter from the Florida State Attorney's Office. Craig was under investigation for attempted fraud, conspiracy, and malicious misuse of mental health protocols. I had expected this to be a civil battle, but it had become something more. Criminal Craig's fall was swift. His business connections cut ties. His credit tanked. He tried to relocate, but the story followed him thanks to a quiet but firm press release from my legal team. Nothing flashy, just facts. The kind that ruin reputations without ever raising your voice. Amber. She never got charged. There wasn't enough to meet the legal standard, but her name was in the filings. The screenshots were public. She tried to launch her own design consultancy a few months later. It didn't go well. Vendors avoided her. Clients ghosted. No one wanted to be associated with someone who betrayed her own mother for property. I didn't celebrate. There were no toasts, no fireworks, just a deep exhale. A release. I moved forward quietly. I sold the house. Yes, that house. Not because I had to, but because I didn't want to live among its shadows anymore. The hallways where I overheard whispers, the dining room where I revealed the truth, the safe that held my survival plan. I bought a smaller home inland, sunlight everywhere. Open windows, no secrets. My business flourished, not because I hustled harder, but because I finally had peace. The kind that doesn't come from money or revenge or even justice. The kind that comes from clarity. I was no longer protecting people who were trying to destroy me. And once I stopped doing that, I started to heal. One morning, about 6 months after the trial, I got a letter. From Amber. It wasn't long. She said she was sorry, said she didn't expect forgiveness, said she was in therapy. I read it twice, then I placed it in a drawer. Unanswered. Because sometimes closure doesn't come from conversation. Sometimes it comes from silence. The silence of knowing you did everything you could, that you protected yourself, that you didn't stoop, didn't scream, didn't burn it all down. You outplanned them. You outlived them. You walked out of the fire with your name, your mind, and your power intact. That's the kind of victory no one can take. People ask me sometimes if I regret it. If I regret cutting my daughter out of my life. If I regret not forgiving Craig. If I regret spending years preparing for a betrayal that in the beginning hadn't even happened yet. And the truth is, no, I don't, because preparing for betrayal is not the same as expecting it. It's not pessimism, it's protection. I used to believe love was enough, that if you gave people everything, your time, your money, your loyalty, they'd return it, multiply it. But love without boundaries becomes a weapon. And I had spent too many years mistaking loyalty for silence, for tolerance, for self-erasure. Amber was my daughter, Craig was my husband, but neither of them respected me enough to see me as a person, only as a stepping stone to something they thought they deserved. I gave them love, they gave me lies, and in the end I gave them something else. Distance. Now, my life is quiet, peaceful, real. I mentor young women entering the design industry. Not just about fabric or layouts or lighting, but about ownership, legal literacy, financial independence, how to read contracts, how to protect their names, their businesses, their futures, because no one taught me that. I had to learn the hard way, so I became the woman I once needed before the world tried to turn me into a victim. Sometimes when I walk through my garden or sit by the window in my new home, I think of Amber, of who she used to be, of who she might still become. I hope therapy helps her, I really do, but healing doesn't always mean reconnection. Sometimes healing means knowing where the wound ends and not picking at it again. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: never confuse shared blood with shared values, and never hand over the keys to your life to people who haven't earned them. I lost a lot when this happened, but I gained something far more valuable myself.